It was a chilly autumn evening when the quiet town of Willow Creek was shaken by an unimaginable tragedy. The kind of event that seemed reserved for far-off headlines, never expected in a peaceful suburban neighborhood. The fire started around 7:30 p.m. Neighbors later recalled seeing thick plumes of smoke rising into the air as they looked out from their windows. The smell of burning wood and something else, something foul, quickly spread, alerting people that something was terribly wrong. Emergency responders were on the scene within minutes, but by then the house was already engulfed in flames. Firefighters worked frantically to control the blaze, their efforts battling both the fire and the intense heat. But by the time they got inside, it was too late. What had initially appeared to be just another house fire soon turned into a case no one was prepared for. Among the ruins, while searching for any survivors, firemen made a grim discovery. The remains of a child were found inside the house. It wasn't immediately clear who the child was, but the sheer horror of finding such a young life extinguished by fire stunned everyone at the scene. At first, authorities assumed it was a tragic accident, a fire that had spread too quickly for the child to escape. The idea that this was anything but a terrible misfortune didn't even cross their minds. The house was small, shabby, and isolated at the end of Elm Street, belonging to a woman named Sarah Matthews and her 5-year-old daughter, Lily. Sarah, who was known in the community as a quiet, reclusive figure, had no history of trouble. She lived there alone with Lily, after her separation from Lily's father years earlier. While there had been no outward signs of trouble, those who knew, Sarah and Lily described them as a tight-knit pair, with the mother doting on her only child. Sarah had always been polite but distant, rarely socializing with neighbors, but she was never seen as a cause for concern. The initial report from the fire department suggested the possibility of an electrical fire or faulty wiring, common in older homes. But as investigators sifted through the debris, something didn't add up. The fire's origin was found to be suspicious. It was deliberately set, with clear signs that accelerants had been used to intensify the flames. The charred remains of the child were positioned in a way that raised even more questions. It was not a random event, but something more calculated, more chilling. The fire didn't just consume the house. It had been carefully orchestrated to destroy everything in its path. Local law enforcement quickly turned their attention to Sarah Matthews, who had been unaccounted for at the time of the fire. Neighbors reported that they hadn't seen her around all day. She hadn't come out to check on the fire, and no one had seen her leave the house. The most troubling part was that Sarah didn't appear distressed or shocked when authorities arrived at her home. There were no tears, no panic. Instead, she seemed strangely calm, too calm for someone whose life had just been consumed by such a horrific loss. In the days that followed, an investigation began to unravel the truth. The authorities couldn't find any immediate family or friends who had seen Sarah in recent days, and no one could account for her whereabouts on the night of the fire. The only thing they knew for certain was that Lily was gone, and something about the whole situation felt deeply wrong. The more they looked into the case, the more the dark truth began to emerge, but no one, not even the seasoned investigators, could have prepared themselves for what they would find. What was once thought to be a tragic accident was becoming something much more sinister. A dark cloud of suspicion began to settle over Sarah Matthews, and as the investigation continued, the entire town was forced to reckon with the unthinkable, that a mother could have been responsible for taking the life of her own child. As the investigation into the fire unfolded, Sarah Matthews became the focus of growing scrutiny. Authorities began by retracing her steps and reviewing her past, hoping to uncover any clues that might explain the strange circumstances surrounding the death of her 5-year-old daughter, Lily. At first, the community was slow to suspect Sarah. She had always kept to herself, and in the eyes of the townspeople, she was just another single mother trying to make ends meet. But as investigators dug deeper into her life, they found unsettling patterns that suggested this wasn't the first time Sarah had considered abandoning her daughter. Sarah's financial struggles were the first thing that became apparent. She had lost her job at a local diner several months earlier, and her small home on Elm Street was in disrepair. Neighbors recalled that Sarah had been visibly stressed in recent weeks, but no one had suspected anything truly dangerous. Sarah had kept a low profile, only speaking with a few close acquaintances and rarely venturing out of her home except for errands. But things started to shift when investigators spoke to a social worker who had been involved in Sarah's life in recent months. The worker revealed that Sarah had made several inquiries about adoption. In fact, she had been in contact with a local agency for quite some time, asking about the process of placing her daughter in another family's care. The social worker explained that while Sarah's intentions were never explicitly stated, her desperation was clear. She had spoken in vague terms about needing a fresh start, about how difficult it was to be a single mother, and about feeling overwhelmed by the constant responsibility of raising a child. She had even mentioned how difficult it was to provide for Lily and how much she needed a way out. When the adoption agency had informed her that Lily was considered too old to be easily placed with a new family, Sarah's hopes had been dashed. According to the social worker, this news seemed to crush whatever was left of Sarah's resolve. She had been determined to find a way to give Lily a better life, or so it seemed. But the adoption agency had told Sarah that, due to her daughter's age, finding a suitable home was going to be a long and complicated process. This rejection, though not unexpected, seemed to send Sarah into a deeper spiral. The social worker remembered that shortly after the news of the adoption rejection, Sarah became noticeably more withdrawn. She stopped attending the meetings she had previously kept, and her communication with the agency ceased entirely. Neighbors reported seeing her more frequently in the days leading up to the fire, but not in a way that suggested she was seeking support or comfort. Instead, she appeared distracted, almost manic, as if her mind was consumed by something darker. Surveillance footage obtained by police from local stores painted a clearer picture. In the days before the fire, Sarah had been seen purchasing large quantities of lighter fluid and a number of other suspicious items. To many, it seemed like just a few items bought out of routine necessity, but investigators saw a different story. There was something unsettling about the way Sarah moved through the store. Not the behavior of someone simply trying to get by, but of someone preparing for something far more sinister. The more the investigation revealed, the clearer it became that Sarah Matthews was not just a mother struggling with the weight of single parenthood. She was someone who had taken calculated steps to rid herself of the very person who should have been her greatest responsibility. The pieces began to fall into place. Sarah had planned this, had worked out a twisted way to rid herself of her daughter. The adoption rejection had been the final straw, the event that pushed her to make the unthinkable decision to permanently escape her reality. The question now wasn't just about how Sarah had done it, but why she had taken such an extreme measure. It seemed impossible to understand, but all the evidence suggested that Sarah Matthews had finally taken matters into her own hands, and Lily had paid the ultimate price for her mother's desperation. As the investigation into Sarah Matthews deepened, the truth grew darker with each passing day. What had initially seemed like an isolated act of desperation began to unfold as a meticulously planned, cold-blooded murder. It became increasingly clear that Sarah hadn't simply been overwhelmed by the responsibilities of motherhood. She had actively sought a way to rid herself of her daughter. The discovery of the items she had purchased in the days leading up to the fire, along with the growing understanding of her mental state, pointed to a chilling conclusion. This was no accident. A forensic team was called in to analyze the scene more thoroughly. They began by investigating the fire's origins and concluded that the flames had been deliberately set. Traces of accelerant, specifically lighter fluid, were found scattered throughout the house. The fire had been designed to spread quickly and efficiently, consuming everything in its path. In fact, the fire had been so intense that it had obliterated most of the home's interior. Yet, as investigators combed through the remains, they found one thing that stood out: the incinerator. In a corner of the house, hidden behind a stack of old, unused furniture, lay a small industrial incinerator. It wasn't something most people would keep in their homes, especially not in a modest house like Sarah's. The incinerator appeared to have been carefully hidden, and its purpose became painfully clear when the forensic experts began their examination. This device, capable of reducing a body to ash, was exactly what it looked like: a tool meant to dispose of evidence, to ensure that nothing, not even a trace of the child's remains, would be left behind. It wasn't an impulsive decision. Sarah had planned this carefully. Authorities turned their attention to Sarah's recent actions. What had seemed like a woman in crisis now appeared to be the behavior of someone with a cold, calculating mind. In the weeks before the fire, Sarah had stopped responding to calls from the adoption agency. She had also withdrawn from the few friends and family members who had once been in her life. Her behavior became more erratic, and at times withdrawn. But perhaps the most telling detail was the series of phone calls she made to a local hardware store, ordering large amounts of lighter fluid, cleaning supplies, and other items typically associated with arson. These purchases were made on the same day she withdrew from the adoption process, and they were made in such an odd sequence that it left investigators wondering, did Sarah know exactly what she was going to do? Meanwhile, Sarah's neighbors provided more unsettling insights into her mental state. One neighbor who had seen Sarah in the days leading up to the fire described her as appearing almost detached, like she was in a trance. She was still going about her daily routine, but there was a sense of emptiness in her actions. She didn't speak much, nor did she show any signs of the grief one might expect after losing a child. Instead, she acted with an eerie calmness, almost as if she had already accepted the outcome. No one realized it at the time, but this behavior now stood out as a clue. As the evidence piled up, the authorities began to piece together the puzzle. Sarah had never intended to let Lily live in another home. She had attempted to place her daughter for adoption only because she had no other options left. When that avenue was closed, Sarah seemed to have viewed her daughter's life as a burden that she couldn't bear any longer. Her fixation on a fresh start was more than just a passing thought. It was an obsession that grew stronger as she felt more isolated and rejected by the world around her. Her actions suggested that Lily had become an obstacle, something standing in the way of the new life Sarah desperately craved. The final, horrifying realization came when investigators linked Sarah to the incinerator. There was no denying the methodical nature of her crime. Sarah had carefully planned every step, from the fire to the destruction of evidence. She had taken measures to ensure that Lily would be erased from the world, her body burned beyond recognition. It wasn't just the fire that had taken her. Life. It was the deliberate choice to end it in such a horrific, cold-hearted manner. There was no room left for doubt. Sarah Matthews had set her own course, and her daughter, Lily, had tragically become collateral damage in her desperate bid for freedom. Now, as the investigation turned towards her eventual arrest, the town of Willow Creek was left reeling. How had the woman they had all known, the quiet, reserved mother, become capable of such a brutal act? And how had anyone missed the signs of a mind so consumed by its own darkness? The answers, though chilling, were becoming painfully clear, and the town's grief was only deepened by the realization that the monster they had feared for so long had been living among them all along. As Sarah Matthews sat in the sterile interrogation room, the weight of her actions hung heavy in the air. Her once calm and detached demeanor began to unravel as the investigators laid out the case against her. For hours she sat in silence, her gaze distant, as they presented the evidence that linked her directly to the death of her daughter, Lily. The pieces were all there: the lighter fluid, the incinerator, the disturbing purchases, all pointing to a premeditated crime. Still, Sarah remained eerily composed, as if the world around her had little to do with the choices she had made. Throughout the investigation, experts had tried to piece together what had driven Sarah to this point. Was she mentally unstable? Was it just the crushing weight of motherhood and isolation that led her to such a horrific act? They found no clear answer. While Sarah had certainly struggled with financial and emotional hardships, the evidence suggested something far darker. She had not simply snapped in a moment of overwhelming stress. Instead, she had made a deliberate choice, a chilling decision to rid herself of the one thing that tethered her to the life she so desperately wanted to escape. Psychiatrists who were brought in to evaluate Sarah found that her mental state was complex. She exhibited symptoms of depression and had a history of anxiety, but there was no indication that she was suffering from any acute psychosis. The experts agreed that Sarah had been rational when she decided to end Lily's life. She had been cold, calculating, and had carefully considered every step. Her actions were not those of a woman overwhelmed by her circumstances, but of a person who had made a chilling, rational decision to kill in order to free herself from the burden she felt her daughter represented. What was most disturbing, however, was the deep sense of entitlement Sarah had felt toward her own life. She saw herself as someone deserving of a fresh start, someone who had been unfairly burdened by the responsibility of motherhood. As investigators dug deeper, they learned that Sarah had often expressed a belief that she needed to be free in order to move on. In her mind, Lily was standing in the way of her happiness. Adoption had been a possibility, a lifeline, but it had been snatched away when the agency informed her that her daughter was too old. That rejection, it seemed, had pushed Sarah to the edge. Without another option in sight, she had taken the final, irreversible step. Family members and friends, once close to Sarah, were left reeling. They had always seen her as a woman who was simply doing her best, a single mother doing what she could to raise her daughter in difficult circumstances. Sarah had never been a party to any obvious signs of abuse, and Lily had never been known to show signs of neglect. But the truth came crashing down, leaving everyone stunned. Sarah had never fully embraced motherhood. She had never fully accepted the responsibility it entailed, even though she had been the one who had brought Lily into the world. And now, in the most horrific way possible, Sarah had decided that she no longer wanted to carry that weight. Town of Willow Creek, once calm and untouched by tragedy, was now gripped by fear and disbelief. A mother had taken the life of her own child, and the town was forced to confront a truth that no one had ever considered. Sometimes the evil that exists within a person isn't always obvious. Sometimes it lurks beneath the surface, hidden behind a facade of normalcy. As Sarah's trial approached, the gravity of her actions began to weigh on her. Though she still maintained an air of detachment, there were moments when cracks in her facade began to show. In private, she seemed lost, a woman haunted by the irreversible nature of what she had done. The guilt, or perhaps the recognition that she had forever sealed her fate, started to sink in. But it was too late. The life she had destroyed, the one that had once been filled with possibility and love, could never be undone. Sarah Matthews was now facing a future defined not by her dreams of freedom, but by the horrific act that had shattered her life and the lives of those around her. She had once been a woman full of hope, but in the pursuit of that hope, she had committed a crime so horrific that it left the entire town of Willow Creek questioning everything they had known about her. The story of Sarah Matthews would not simply be about a tragic loss of life. It would be a story about the darkness that can exist inside even the most unsuspecting people, a darkness that, once unleashed, could never be undone. As the trial of Sarah Matthews began, the small courtroom in Willow Creek became a battleground for justice. The case had captivated not only the local community, but also attracted the attention of the nation. How could a mother do such a thing? How could someone entrusted with the life of a child, someone who should have loved and protected her, so callously end that life? These were the questions on everyone's mind, and the court would soon have to answer them. Sarah's defense team argued that she was suffering from severe mental illness, that the pressures of single motherhood, financial instability, and emotional isolation had driven her to a breaking point. They painted a picture of a woman who had snapped under the weight of her circumstances. They tried to portray Sarah as someone who was not fully in control of her actions, someone overwhelmed by feelings of hopelessness and despair. Experts were brought in to testify about her mental state, suggesting that Sarah might have been experiencing postpartum depression, or that years of emotional neglect had warped her ability to make rational decisions. It was an argument that sought to find compassion for a mother in distress, and it initially gained some traction with the jury. But the prosecution countered with a case that was damning in its simplicity. They presented the evidence, the cold, hard facts that showed Sarah's actions were not those of a woman who had simply lost control, but of someone who had meticulously planned a murder. They laid out the timeline, showing that Sarah had bought the lighter fluid, the cleaning supplies, and the incinerator, all in the days leading up to the fire. They revealed how she had hidden the incinerator, a device designed to destroy evidence, in the corner of her home. Most importantly, they highlighted Sarah's lack of grief, her lack of emotion when confronted with the loss of her daughter. There was no hysterical crying, no outpouring of anguish. Instead, Sarah had acted with a cold detachment, one that suggested she had already made peace with what she had done. The most chilling part of the prosecution's case was the testimony of the adoption agency workers. They revealed that Sarah had been desperate to give Lily away, but when told the child was too old to be adopted, Sarah had become withdrawn and seemingly indifferent to the future. The prosecution argued that it was this rejection, this final door closing on Sarah's plan for escape, that pushed her to murder. She had not just been trying to rid herself of her responsibilities, they argued. She had been seeking a way to erase her daughter entirely from her life, to free herself of the one person standing in the way of her new beginning. The trial became a clash between two irreconcilable truths. The defense insisted that Sarah was a victim of her circumstances, a woman broken by a world that had failed her. The prosecution, on the other hand, painted a picture of a cold-blooded murderer who had made a deliberate choice to extinguish the life of a helpless child. As the trial continued, it became clear that the evidence was overwhelming. The jury had seen the surveillance footage, heard from the forensic experts, and listened to the testimony that linked Sarah directly to her daughter's death. There was no denying the facts. Sarah Matthews had set the fire. She had planned the murder, and she had destroyed the evidence in an attempt to cover her tracks. The defense's argument of mental illness seemed to fall on deaf ears. The jury could not ignore the calculated nature of Sarah's crime. When the verdict was finally delivered, it came as little surprise. Sarah Matthews was found guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom fell into silence as the jury's decision was read aloud. The woman who had once been seen as a struggling single mother was now a convicted killer, her future forever marked by the horror of her actions. Sarah's face remained impassive as the sentence was handed down. Life in prison, without the possibility of parole. The community of Willow Creek was left reeling in the aftermath of the trial. The tragic loss of Lily, a young girl whose life had been snuffed out by the very person who should have loved and protected her, would never be forgotten. Sarah's actions had shattered the trust that people had in one another, leaving a town that had once been peaceful and quiet, grappling with a grief too deep to comprehend. In the years that followed, Sarah Matthews became a name associated with one of the most horrifying acts a mother could commit. Her story would continue to serve as a chilling reminder that sometimes the darkness within a person isn't something that can be seen on the surface. It can be hidden behind a smile, behind the facade of a mother trying her best. But for those who knew the truth, there was no escaping the reality that Sarah Matthews had taken the life of her own child.